Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Gurnam Singh, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a new series of the Sikh Think Tank Show on Punjab Broadcast Channel Sky 768. In today's show, we turn our attention to the subject that is both complex and controversial: the rise of so-called Indian godmen, particularly in the West, in the UK, in Europe, and in America. Beginning in the 1960s, during a time of counterculture and social upheaval, a number of charismatic figures from India, yogis, gurus, etc., gained a remarkable following in Europe and North America. Perhaps the most famous of all was the Maharishi yogi, who later was arrested and then deported from the States. Amongst the most prominent that's connected to Sikhs was Harbhajan Singh Puri, widely known as Yogi Bhajan, who attracted thousands of followers and built a multi-million-dollar empire. Yet behind this facade of spirituality, these movements have often been marked by cult-like structures, exploitation, and serious allegations of emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. Now, to unpack this history and to reflect on its ongoing impact, we are joined today by Philip Deslippe from Los Angeles, USA. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Gurnam. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's really good to have you. I'll just to give a brief background on Philip. So Philip is a historian of religious movements and is currently completing his PhD at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In 2012, he published a paper review article in Sikh Formations Journal on the origins of Yogi Bhajan Singh's Kundalini Yoga, which has since been translated into 6 languages. Along with Stacey Stucken, he has co-written 2 investigative features for Bars News about the corporate structure of Yogi Bhajan's empire and the extensive abuse that took place within his organization. Now, Philip has been a subject matter expert for 3HO or for Time magazine, and recently a documentary series called Breath of Fire, which was broadcast on HBO Max, but also on Netflix. I think it was in 2021. So, Philip, you've been pretty busy, and you're busy with your PhD as well. But before we can launch into some of the issues around the cults and these Indian godmen, just give me a bit of your own kind of background, really. How do you end up becoming interested in this topic?
So my very first week as an undergraduate at the University of Connecticut, I took a class in Kundalini Yoga, and I kept taking Kundalini Yoga, and I was involved with 3HO for about a decade. And when I started my graduate studies, I was primarily interested in metaphysical teachers from the early 20th century. And as I started developing chops as a researcher, a little light bulb went off, and I started to wonder, well, what would happen if I took what I knew as a researcher and started to apply it to Yogi Bhajan and Kundalini Yoga, the system of yoga that I knew. And what I quickly found as I started doing the research and getting texts and source material and interviewing people was very much like these metaphysical teachers from the early 20th century. Yogi Bhajan made up his lineage. And I published an article for Sikh Formations that described in abundant detail exactly how Yogi Bhajan made up his Kundalini Yoga. And that was in 2012. And I thought, foolishly, well, this will be the end of it. And I continued studies, mostly historical, from the 1900s up until about the 1950s. And then in 2020, there was a great kind of unraveling within 3HO. And then,
Philip, we'll come to that, because that's going to be one of our focus. But I just still want to get a sense of you and your own kind of how you were drawn into that. I mean, were you raised in a religious family? Were you from a different background? How did those early experiences maybe impact the way in which because you said that you were looking for something, and this idea of spirituality seemed to be quite attractive, not to you, but thousands of other people. Yeah.
I was raised in a culturally Catholic home. And as I started to do yoga, I was also already interested in vegetarian cooking and other things. But I've always I've always had the mind of a nerd. So even when I was doing these things, I was always curious and reading and looking
Okay.
into exactly what was going on. And I think in the case of 3HO, that's very helpful because it really does have its own world, its own practices, its own terminology. And I think in a way, you almost need to be exposed to it to be able to fully
Okay.
understand it and talk about it.
So if we do take a more of a kind of historical and sociological perspective rather than the personal one, because that's a whole other kind of program in itself, and I know that you've uncovered many case studies really, and others are emerging. But just from your research, more generally, what were the key social and cultural kind of conditions in the West, and maybe in USA particularly, maybe in California, because
Mm-hmm.
that seemed to be a real kind of magnet for these yogis during the 60s and 70s that enabled people like, Harbhajan Singh, but we also talk about the Maharishi, Osho, and a whole lot of others to gain such influence amongst young people, amongst educated people, amongst powerful people.
Mhm. Well, I mean, the simple answer and the answer that you will see again and again on documentaries is the hippie counterculture. The hippies were on a search, these godmen appear, and then they meet. I think the reality is a little bit more complicated than that. When we look at the actual numbers of people in the 60s and 70s who are engaging with these teachers in the long term, those numbers are different. They're very small. Maybe a large number of people encounter these spiritual teachers, but a smaller number join their groups, and an even smaller number of those people stay in those groups and become a part of them. Um, I think one of the factors that's important to recognize is that there is in the environment, there is a deep kind of spiritual narrative. There's a professor named Lola Williamson who did a book called Transcendent in America. And one of her fascinating findings, as she interviews members of various different spiritual groups, is that they are all, regardless of the group that they're in, they are all imbibing the same books. Carlos Castaneda, Autobiography of a Yogi, um, Zen books on Zen Buddhism. So they are all steeped in this kind of mixture that puts forward this idea that you need a spiritual teacher, that there are these incomprehensible wise masters from the East. So that is in the air. And so it's not just that these teachers find students, but students are very much hoping for and expecting
Yeah.
a guru figure. And many of them even say that. They'll say things like, I was guru shopping, I was
Mm,
looking for a guru. I think there's another important factor. When I mentioned that a lot of people encounter these teachings, a few join groups, and even fewer stay, I think there are different factors at play. And there were several sociologists and anthropologists who studied 3HO in the early 70s. And I know from the hundreds of interviews I've done with 3HO members, there are patterns that emerge of why do certain people find a group like 3HO or find spiritual teachers like Yogi Bhajan attractive.
mm,
And I think there are three main factors. One is a religious childhood. Um, Disproportionately, members who join and stay in groups like 3HO, they grow up Catholic, they grow up Jewish. The idea of a religious life and a religious home makes sense to them. We know from a lot of the studies that people have done of these groups in the early 70s, there is a disproportionate amount of drug use. And this is a common narrative we see.
yeah.
People are experimenting with drugs, and these groups offer both a kind of comparable search for
Mm,
experience, but also a lifestyle that can help get them
yeah.
off of drugs.
Just on that,
And I,
Philip, I just want to
yeah,
explore if I can a bit more. I mean, you say they invariably come from religious backgrounds, and you referenced particularly Catholic backgrounds and Jewish backgrounds. There is a sense that within those traditions that they can be quite conservative, and that this idea that particularly around sexual kind of repression. And I say that because one of the kind of characteristics of these Indian yogis is almost freeing people up. I mean, I remember the Osho, the Maharishi yogi, and his tantric kind of yoga and association with sex, and almost this idea of kind of free love and free association, which kind of very much kind of overlays that kind of hippie culture, doesn't it, as well? So do you think there was something of a reaction to that kind of repressed emotions, the repressed sexuality that was produced through the kind of Orthodox churches and those Western religions, if you like?
I mean, I think a good comparison would be neighborhoods within a city. Many people will enter the same city, but they will settle in different neighborhoods. And so
Mm,
I think, some of those differences, they make sense when you see that spiritual seekers, even at the same time and in the same country, they are looking for different things. If people are looking
mm,
for sexual freedom and exploration, maybe they will go and gravitate towards someone like Bhagwan Sri
mm,
Rajneesh. If people are looking for a more kind of traditional family structure, they might veer
yeah,
towards a different group. I
yeah.
think the third factor that I was going to mention that I think is very important is in the interviews that I've done with members of 3HO, and we see this with other groups, is the reality of childhood trauma. To be really blunt, you have to be a particular person to see a very angry, abusive patriarchal figure and have it make sense to you on some level. And there's so many interviews I've done with first generation 3HO members where you're almost waiting for the shoe to drop and for them to say, but I was abused by my dad. My mom was an
Mm,
alcoholic. I had a difficult family. And I think
mm,
many people unknowingly recreate those kind of childhood environments in these kind
mm.
of groups.
Okay,
Um,
so I just want to. I mean, we talked about the '60s counterculture. Woodstock, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And part of that counterculture was also kind of going against what was deemed to be as Western materialism, if you like, yeah, and looking to the East. Now, I'm not sure to what extent this sense that the East could give you spirituality and enlightenment was itself a kind of stereotype, a kind of a Orientalist kind of construction of the non-Western other as being kind of more concerned not with material matters but with immaterial things. Whether that was part of a construction, but how has that changed? Because many of these, I know that a number of these yogis and gurus were scandalized, but they're still, but they also morphed, didn't they, from maybe being kind of quite friendly kind of characters, almost kind of loving kind of humorous characters, to becoming kind of heads of business empires. So how's that kind of journey from being a single person to leading a huge business? I mean, you're talking about in Oregon, I think they almost bought kind of thousands of acres. What's going on there? Because here's kind of capitalism and capital moving in, commoditization of the guru, if you like.
so I would break that down into two parts. I think the first part, as you mentioned, what is the appeal of these godmen in the West? And
Mm,
something that I find stunning that kind of bridges my earlier historical interests up until the present moment is we really have, at least in the United States, about 150 years of this same kind of exoticism and stereotype. The idea that these spiritual teachers from the East are holders of special wisdom, that has been going on for so long. I mean, in my thinking, there are several factors that all kind of combine for that. People in the West, especially the United States, know very little about India and other places. So, in that ignorance, they're kind of free to make things up. There's the general exoticism and Orientalism that happens. Um, you know, People in the West imagine that people in the East are somehow radically, essentially different than they are. There's popular culture. Popular culture feeds this narrative from comic books and dime novels at the turn of the century, all the way up to things like Eat, Pray, Love today. That same idea that there's wisdom and peace to be found in the East. And I also think there's the feedback loop of spiritual seekers. Spiritual seekers repeat these ideas so that other people expect to see that. So, one of the things that we find with Godmen coming to the West is, in some ways, it's a door that's already been unlocked for them.
Mm.
When people come to California in the late 1960s, or when Srila Prabhupada comes to New York in the early 60s, or the Maharishi comes to America in the late 50s, there is a huge segment of the population that naturally expects them to be saintly holy men. There was a great memoir written, I think, in the 1930s or 40s about an Indian man who's in the United States, and he's bewildered when these middle class housewives ask him about meditation and if he can find lost items, because they naturally assume that he has these magical powers. To
Mm.
answer the second part of your question, how do we go from a singular person arriving to large empires, to businesses? I think the simplest explanation comes from Yogi Bhajan. There's a phrase that he loved to use that he saw on a late night television infomercial: OPM, OPI, other people's money, other people's intelligence. And I think the godmen who build the largest empires, they are able to successfully utilize the resources and intelligence and labor
Mm.
of their students to build these
Yeah.
empires. And I
Can
think
I
that
also
ties. Oh,
Yeah,
go
can
ahead.
I also add, Philip, onto that is I mean, one of the ways in which you build an empire is by manipulation of kind of the image, yeah,
Yeah.
manipulation, and these people are very good at that. And today, if you go to in India, some of the gurus are much better than even some of the mainstream organizations in advertising and in marketing. And Yogi Bhajan Singh was very good at that. I mean, you see images of him with leaders, with presidents, with professors, with heads of universities, even with the Pope. I think there's a picture of him with the Pope. To what extent was this part of their strategy for getting kind of acceptance?
Um, I mean, I think
Or
in the
was
case
this
of
a
Yogi,
conspiracy? Are we seeing people conspiring? I mean, were these politicians so foolish not to realize that what could happen in these encounters?
I mean, I think there's a couple things there. I think number one, I would caution against um, interpreting a photo opportunity or paying money to attend a fundraising dinner with some kind of alliance or endorsement. When you
Mm.
look through the periodicals of 3HO throughout the 70s and 80s, there are endless photographs with politicians and mayors and religious leaders. And these seem to just be photo ops. There's no real lasting connection for most of these. It's just for appearances. And in the case of Yogi Bhajan, I think part of this has to do with the general ignorance that the American public, and in Europe, that people have about Sikhi. People in the West are very familiar with Judeo-Christian structures of hierarchy and organization. We know what a Catholic priest is and how they're different than a bishop or a cardinal. The American public is incredibly ignorant still today about Hinduism and Sikhism and Buddhism and Jainism. So there really is kind of an open road for anyone to step forward like Yogi Bhajan and say, I represent these people. I am a leader.
So you think
People will question.
those vulnerabilities are still here today, and
I would say,
all the more reason why we need to really study how these people gain traction, how they gain confidence, and how they then set up very powerful empires. So, I mean, I know that a lot of your research, as we said earlier on, you were involved with the documentary series, and you've written articles on this. So, Yogi Bhajan is presented both as this kind of charismatic spiritual leader. And even people like myself, I've got to be honest, when I was in my early 20s, I did, come across the 3HO and Yogi Bhajan's followers. And, I was very impressed by them, their kind of seeming commitment to kind of pure Sikhi, to really want to learn and to develop every aspect. So it was a very inspirational, both for Sikhs like myself living in the West who were looking to find my own place. But he's also a deeply controversial figure. So on the one hand, these people, spread, as it were, Sikhi in the West. But the financial exploitation and abuse that's coming out now. How do we weigh up these legacies and the wider phenomena? Where should we? I mean, we know what's emerging now, but in the kind of bigger sweep of history, how do we make sense of somebody like Yogi Bhajan?
I mean, I think there's several assumptions in that question that we
Mm,
need to kind of unpack and talk about.
mm,
The first is Yogi Bhajan's supposed charisma. I think Yogi Bhajan is not charismatic without his students and without their help. If you look at raw footage of him giving a lecture to his students, it's ridiculous. It's like you've got a drunken, rambling uncle who's like snorting up phlegm and rambling incoherently and going from topic to topic and yelling at people. Um, Yogi Bhajan's charisma is very much tied to all the efforts that his students make to make him look good and to make him seem eloquent. You know, there are so many things in 3HO periodicals talking about his teachings or how Yogi Bhajan learned Kundalini Yoga. And those are literally cobbled together from fragments of his lectures and made into this coherent, eloquent
mm,
whole. And so I think that charisma and that kind of, the good figure that he casts in the world, a lot of that is stagecraft. And also, I think it's important to remember the idea of dissimulation. Dissimulation is the idea that what you present to the outside, what people outside can see, is different than who you are and different than how you present yourself on the inside. So you are not alone. I've talked to many people in the diaspora who said when they first saw 3HO, it was like this startling thing. My goodness, we have these Western white Sikh converts. When you get into what they actually believe and what they're doing, that would give you pause. Um, I tend to think that all of the things that were hallmarks of 3HO that people see as being very orthodox and proper and traditional Sikhi, they were also the things that you could do very quickly and without a lot of work or engagement with the Punjabi language, Punjabi culture, and
mm,
Punjabi Sangats. I can change my name today. I can stop cutting my
mm,
hair today. I can wear all white clothing today, and I can look like a Sikh. But when you get into a lot of 3HO practices,
mm.
I think it would be puzzling, if not offensive, to most Sikhs. The
Yeah.
idea that you don't need to understand Gurbani, that the only
Mm,
real value in Gurbani is the movement of your mouth because it's affecting your
mm,
glands like a computer code. The fact that the Sikh gurus
mm,
supposedly did Kundalini yoga, that Kundalini yoga created the Sikh tradition. I mean, these are just a few examples of
mm,
how bizarre the 3HO version of Sikhi
mm,
really is if you go beyond the appearances and the public
mhm.
presentation.
I mean, just to counter that slightly, I mean, I've read 3HO literature, and while some of the literature does often, unscientific kind of claims about the kind of physical effects of some of these things, nonetheless, you do also find very interesting material that's trying to engage with scripture and tradition in ways that doesn't seem to be outlandish, seems to be scholarly. Of course, amongst the followers, there were very many educated people with PhDs and the like.
Uh,
So,
well,
okay,
well,
so
hold on. Are we talking legitimate PhDs or are we talking
well, this
diploma mill
this is this is the
PhDs?
impression that one has, that he actually drew in a lot of very educated people, and that that was part of his appeal, that he could almost offer you a scientific kind of justification for these practices. Is that a characteristic of some of these godmen, that they often, they've got this kind of forked tongue? On the one hand, it's spirituality and otherworldliness, but they also present it in a way that's can sound to be scientific, kind of pseudoscience.
I mean, I think, to go back to an earlier question about what was the appeal of these godmen
Mm,
in the West, how did they find a footing? I think something that often gets overlooked is they themselves are learning and adapting to their followers. It's a
mm,
strange dance
mm,
where, on one level, it's very hierarchical. The students are looking up to the teacher is telling the students. But the reality is that many of these teachers are paying close attention to the society around them, what their students want, and they are adjusting how they describe their teachings, their ideas to fit the mold that the students want. So, as you know, the scientific rhetoric, the educated rhetoric, that's common throughout. To use the example of Yogi Bhajan, um, in the late 60s, early 70s, when so many of his female students were about feminism and women's liberation, he adopts that language. But his teachings are incredibly patriarchal. His teachings say, women are emotional. Women shouldn't talk too much. Women should just serve their husbands and have babies. That's
mm,
their value. But he's able to use that rhetoric, which is still mentioned today. He knows his students are hippies and they believe in communal living, and so that rhetoric is used. That's they believe, oh, we're living communally. I mean, my favorite example, which I find hilarious, I interviewed several people in 1968, 1969, who are some of Yogi Bhajan's first hosts. And one story they told was, you have these wide-eyed hippie followers who want to do everything that Yogi Bhajan did. And so the students were whispering among themselves, and they said, the yogi, he gets pizza at this one stand. So let's go there. We're going to have what the yogi had. And they go
yeah.
there and they ask the vendor, like, do we want the pizza that the yogi gets? And he's like, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I know that guy. And he hands them slices of pepperoni,
Yeah.
and they're befuddled. And when they approach him, I mean, it's not a shock that, Punjabi migrant in 1969 is going to be eating meat.
Mm,
When they come to him, he quickly realizes, ooh,
mm,
this doesn't work. And so he told them, you know what? This was a test. I was testing you and you passed. Good on you for not eating meat. I would never do such a thing.
mm, mm. I,
So
I
I think
suppose,
it's a,
yeah, I
yeah,
suppose, Philip, one of the, I mean, in a sense, it is water under the bridge to some extent, although we still have these godmen operating, across the world. And in fact,
yeah,
if you look at the numbers of scandals that happen in India, it's not as if these people have an easy ride in India. In fact,
yeah,
one of the ironies is if you look at the Sikh tradition, one of its key kind of objectives was to expose these godmen.
yeah,
Nanak exposes them, yet somehow Sikhs themselves became entrapped, and therein lies another kind of question I think that I'd like to kind of explore now, which is around kind of cult formation. What
yeah,
ways do these movements kind of cross the line from being simply spiritual communities? Because we have them, we have them in the
mhm,
UK. We have people who, are kind of adopting almost similar kind of rhetoric to these
mhm.
Indian god men. So how do we kind of differentiate between a kind of cult, the dangers of this becoming a cultish kind of organization exploited by people who have got ulterior motives, and those that might genuinely be interested in spirituality and wanting to help people to heal and to engage. There must be some place for that spiritual, aspects of living as well. So how do you kind of distinguish the two? Particularly today,
So,
we do have this kind of mindfulness industry now, where there's almost kind of scientific legitimacy, if I put that in inverted commas, for some of these meditative practices.
I did an article for a British journal called Implicit Religion, where I poured through thousands, tens of thousands of examples of the word cult being used in American newspapers in the 1990s.
Mm,
And one of the findings that I had is when in popular media in America, the public understands a cult, I would argue, through some combination of four factors: fraud, harm, exploitation, and isolation. If you have any one of these, the public isn't going to call it a cult. We look at the Amish, they're an isolated community. No one calls them a cult. There are acts of religious fraud, but people don't call, the preacher who fakes a miraculous healing a cult. When these things combine, when you have a religious group that is committing fraud, they're isolating their members, they're exploiting the members, and there's a potential for harm. This is what the public understands as a cult. And I think that is a good measure of how to understand different groups. Are they making dubious or fraudulent claims? Are members or followers being isolated from the rest of their religious community, their families, the public at large? Are they being exploited? What is happening to their money and their time and their labor? Is that going to someone else's benefit to an extreme degree? And is there a potential to harm? I think these are very kind of simple and basic mile markers that we can use to understand something as a
Yeah.
cult. And I think,
I
to get to
also, I
your
also
point
wonder,
about,
just on that one, I also wonder, Philip, if, we live in a much more literate kind of world now, with the internet, and there's a lot more information out there. I also wonder whether sometimes what these people who have got ulterior motives is that they'll bend kind of existing critiques, theories, for example, about coloniality, about the West, and about science. We see, for example, in these kind of anti-vax, you know, conspiracy theories, and then they often use that to put doubts in people's minds, and that kind of makes those people then vulnerable to alternative. Maybe, do you think there's something there as well that's kind of at play here? It's almost as if critical social theory has itself created opened these kind of possibilities for these people to have alternative epistemologies, alternative worldviews. Now, I'm not saying that there are alternative worldviews, but they all need to be subject to reason, critical analysis. But somehow these people think that even that, they shouldn't be subject to that, because that in itself falls back to a kind of Western viewpoint.
I mean, I think it goes back to those 4 points of fraud, harm, isolation, and exploitation. It's just a different version of that. Instead of a Godman telling you in the 1970s, don't listen to your family is bad for you. Instead, it's don't listen to the medical establishment. They're lying. They're bad for you. And most importantly, what happens with that isolation or those claims? They always lead back to the leader. They're trying to sell you something. They are trying to establish themselves as the source of knowledge and power and healing. And I think another important thing is, as we see this, we've seen the rise over decades of mindfulness meditation and yoga and other kind of healing modalities. I mean, I always think a great kind of way to view them is view it as any other trade or any other skill. If I hire a plumber to come and fix my sink, am I going to stop and be like, I'm not really happy with my job. What do you think I should do for a career? If we go to an auto mechanic, we're not going to say, I'm having marriage troubles. What do you think I should do? But yet that's kind of the hallmark of exploitive spiritual teachers, is to have this supposed expertise that then expands across all the boundaries of someone's life to
Yeah.
dictate to them all these things that they should do, the medicine they should take, the food they should eat, who they should associate with, what they should wear. I think that is a great hallmark of something being harmful and
But
exploitive.
so let's just, this is really important, because there are many followers of all faiths who who do believe that there are powerful kind of effects through spiritual practices, and we don't want to be, as it were, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, unless you're arguing that we should be doing. I mean, you know, should we be, your kind of the new atheists, Dawkins and people like that? Should we really be following the warnings that they're giving, or do we need to try to find a middle ground here? Otherwise, you may just end up being seen as part of the enemy. You are part of the conspiracy.
I mean, I think that's the thing about fraudulent spiritual teachers and their
Mm.
organizations. They can make an enemy out of anything. It's either colonialism, it's racism, or we have secret teachings that other people don't know about, or it's big pharma. There's always a reason available for them to discount naysayers. I also think it's dangerous to take personal experience as some kind of measure of truth. I wrote an article for the online magazine, The Revealer, about two different meditations within 3HO where you gaze into someone else's face, either a person
Yeah,
or a
yeah.
place.
That was like
And
a tantric. That was like a kind of tantric thing, wasn't it? Yeah.
yeah, and there have been people completely separate from anything religious or spiritual who've done studies on visual perception. And within a few minutes, if you stare into the face of someone else in person, yourself in the mirror, a photograph or a painting, your visual perception is going to start glitching. You're going to have hallucinations. And I was stunned when I interviewed people for this article, people who did the 3HO exercises. I wasn't stunned that they had these hallucinations because they happened at the exact same rate that they would happen in a laboratory setting. But what was startling was how these ecstatic experiences were used as a justification to stay in a group long after these people knew that something was terribly wrong. They held it up as, well, there must be something there. There must be some sort of magic or power because, this photograph spoke to me. I heard a voice. This yoga person's face changed into someone else's face.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing, that kind of measure
Well,
of my
yeah,
experience, what I felt, that can also be very dangerous
yeah.
and misleading.
If I can just come back on that, and certainly in India, we've had a long-established rationalist movement who go
Mhm.
around exposing these fake godmen in the villages by performing the kind of tricks, and showing the people that these are just tricks and not miracles. And
Yeah.
of course, I think this is again, often these godmen do make. I mean, as well as making offering scientific justification, they also offer a kind of a kind of miracle justification as well. And it's often that then is difficult to evaluate. But somehow we've got all these kind of new journals or new kind of a pseudo-science I mentioned earlier on, where these people are referencing, particularly the mindfulness industry. There
Mhm.
are academics within respectable universities in the West who are actually suggesting that there are some benefits here. In fact, in the UK, you've got the medical establishment now recommending mindfulness as a kind. GPs recommending it to people. Now, is it that mindfulness itself is dangerous, or is it a particular interpretation of mindfulness and effects of mindfulness that would be of concern to you?
I mean, one of the things that I found striking about not just 3HO, but other groups is when you look at the actual benefits that people are getting, what they're actually doing, it's very boring and mundane. Um, People say that, my life turned around, I'm so much healthier. And when you hear what they're doing or when you know what their practices are, you think, well, yeah, of course. You change your diet, you're exercising regularly, you're meeting with a regular group of people, you have a kind of a social
Mm,
life. Of course, you're going to be happier. Of course, you're going to
mm,
feel better physically. I think the danger is not in so much what people do, but how those things are then taken and manipulated. There's a
mm,
difference between me saying, Gurnam, maybe you should go for a 3 kilometer walk every evening and cut down on the salt and, call your mates once a week. Um, Between that and then I am telling you this because, a spirit has commanded me to, or I'm
mm,
reading your aura. And so this is why I'm telling you this. I think
yeah.
in some ways it's very tricky that like
Mm,
practical, good advice that works can then be manipulated. I think there's also something to, a kind of scientific literacy of, there are studies on mindfulness and yoga and everything else, but what do they actually say? One of the things that's shocking with a lot of the kind of yoga therapy industry is that teachers and schools will promote scientific studies. See, yoga works. It does this, it does that. When you read the actual studies that they're citing or that they're referencing, they don't say
mm,
that at all. They're saying like, we
Mm.
did a mediocre study of 9 people, and we need to do more research to get
Yeah.
anything conclusive. But
Yeah.
just studies alone are enough to assure people that
You're
this is
absolutely
legitimate.
right. I mean, most of the so-called scientific claims that I've come across for the benefits of these things either don't differentiate the benefits that you would get anywhere from stretching or from just kind of breathing and things.
Well,
And
that's always the thing that I wonder too. Is it's the normal standard. You see this with so many scientific studies. Doing yoga every day for 30 days does this. Okay, but what if I did the 3 kilometer walk? What
exactly,
if I
yeah.
did simple calisthenics? What if I, regularly called my family? We made it a point to talk on the phone once a week.
It's
You never
interesting.
really have that reference.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know in the States, but in the UK, there has been a proliferation of yoga classes in the gurdwaras. Although
Yeah.
interesting, a lot of the committees now are saying, look, if this is stretching kind of exercises, then fine. But if you wanted to try and take it further and claim some kind of psychic and some kind of cosmic energy is working, then this is against Sikhism, and we wouldn't allow that. I don't know if you know, but I think there was a World International Yoga Day that was kind
Yeah.
of promoted by Modi, and there was quite a lot of interesting discussion around that. But this idea of yoga being the kind of antidote to all the
Mhm.
problems of the world, now that kind of does feed, as you were saying, big business. Now Yogi Bhajan, he had
Mhm.
numerous enterprises. So he was offering, yogi tea, all these healthy kind of things. Were they just healthy things, that somehow because of, it being called yogi tea or whatever, just gets this aura of it, something extraordinary? Is that just another marketing strategy?
Well, Stacy Stukin and I wrote an article for Boz about the corporate structure of Yogi Bhajan's empire, and I think the story with the businesses, there are I think two main aspects. Number one, other people's money, other people's intelligence. His students were fortunate enough to be involved in the natural food business at the right time, right when it was at its very beginnings, late 60s, early 70s. They're wanting to do tea and granola and these other things. But I think it's also important to realize that for him, the businesses were just another asset to take. There's a very clear documented chronology in the mid 70s of how Yogi Bhajan claims a fake title of Siri Singh Sab, how he establishes a corporation soul in the United States, the same kind of corporate body that the British monarchy is, and how he uses that along with this apocalyptic rhetoric to get his students to sign over their homes, their businesses, their inheritances, 10% of their earnings to his religion, which he singularly controls. I think that's like with a lot of the legacy of these people, and especially Yogi Bhajan, is I think you don't want to be um, misled from what is actually happening. The businesses do a certain thing, the businesses are of a certain quality, but I think the real story is just the seizing of assets. I don't think it really mattered to Yogi Bhajan if they were tea companies or oil companies. And we see that with Call Security. What's Call Security doing in the 2000s? They're doing government contracts that are detaining Punjabi migrants at the border. They were doing all sorts of things that are not yogic. So I think it's kind of buying into their PR to make that assumption. And I do want to talk about the the yoga in the British Gurdwaras. When I went to the Slough Gurdwara in I think it was January 2020, I was shocked and horrified to see all the posters for Yogi Bhajan's yoga. I think it was up in the Lunger Hall and like the notices. I mean,
I think
another thing is, look at the little basics of Sikhi programs where for the kids, they sing the song "We Are the Khalsa, Mighty Mighty Khalsa." Where does that come from? That's an
Well,
American
I mean,
chant that comes from
you could
WHO.
argue that, but you might want to argue that not everything that the 3HO or Yogi Bhajan curated, produced was necessarily problematic. I mean, I know, for example, some of those stories that they did, the English in English language, were very inspirational, and I used to, play it to my kids as well. So I think we do need to maybe sift out the kind of those aspects that are clearly problematic from those that maybe have some kind of value. And therein lies the tension, I think, with the legacies with these people, because, it could be argued that, I mean, the 3HO, I think the organization is still there. I know that there's been fragmentation. Some of the yogi teachers, the Kundalini teachers, have just gone independent and doing their own thing now, which may or may not be a good thing. But, some people might argue that, he did establish a presence amongst the Westerners, a Sikh presence, and many of those followers now have kind of realized that, of the kind of the folly of Yogi Bhajan, but they've now embraced Sikhi in a different way. Another argument might be that, he's just produced lots of little Yogi Bhajans. I don't know. Where do you come in on that one?
I would say two things. One about his legacy, and then something else. I think a very fair measure of anyone's legacy after they die, is what were their actions and what were the results of their life. I think that is a fair criteria to judge anyone. And it's difficult to look at what Yogi Bhajan did and the result of his efforts, and not see him as a horrible sociopathic scoundrel. I mean, the facts are, despite the beliefs of like spreading Sikhi, 3HO was never larger than 3,000 to 5,000 people, core committed members. This is what numerous sociologists and anthropologists said in their studies.
Well, we were often hearing numbers in the hundreds of thousands, that he had hundreds of thousands of followers.
No, I mean, this is inside, outside sociologists, people who study, who look at mailing lists, who count heads, never bigger than 3,000 to 5,000. That is PR. That's the PR that Yogi Bhajan did from the very beginning. When he went to the Golden Temple in early 1971, he held up a photo of him at the Atlanta Pop Festival with the big crowds who were there for a rock concert. And he said, "These are all the converts I'm making. They are chanting the Nam. This is what I'm doing." What is Yogi Bhajan's legacy? The report commissioned by 3HO itself to a third-party consultancy group called an Olive Branch. Just looking at Yogi Bhajan, they concluded, more likely than not, he abused dozens of women and underage girls, rape, sexual battery, assault, grooming, sexual harassment. We look at the history of crime within 3HO in the 80s and 90s. We have the largest drug smuggling operation in American history up to that time, marijuana from Thailand. We have telemarketing fraud in Los Angeles, gemstone fraud, gun smuggling.
So this is quite a list of allegations. I mean, are these allegations, or are these?
They're all documented. They are all documented.
So you could, I mean, these are your views. They're not the views of the channel, and but you would say that you could defend every one of these allegations or these claims.
I made these allegations on the Breath of Fire documentary series, and I went through in excruciating detail with HBO's lawyers and fact checkers to back up every single one of those claims. Like the investigative reports that Stacey and I did for Boz News, line by line, point for point, supported by multiple verifiable sources. When you take all of that stuff together, the abuse of hundreds and hundreds of young people in boarding schools and ashrams, it's very difficult to work around that. And I would also suggest, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of the blue zones, this theory of like longevity and healthy diets. So the blue zone theory is a very popular book that says, maybe for the best way of eating and living for the longest, healthiest life, we should look at parts of the world that have the longest life expectancy. So the Mediterranean and Japan and other places, what are they doing? These must be the exemplars and case studies of proper living. I would suggest, if we want to look at the legacy of Yogi Bhajan, what Sikh Dharma and Kundalini Yoga does, look at their blue zones. Look at the communities of followers who've been practicing their yoga and Yogi Bhajan's teachings for 30, 40, 50 years. What better case study to see if it works or not? What do we see in Los Angeles and Espanola, New Mexico, and Herndon, Virginia? We see these practitioners aging and dying like everyone else. We see extensive histories of crime and abuse, small, dwindling, isolated communities where, in large measure, the second generation, the men and women born and raised in 3HO, are leaving the group and leaving Sikhi. That should be a very kind of resounding conclusion about Yogi Bhajan's legacy. And I think, to make it even more awkward, I mean, I know that we're approaching the end of
The
the
end, yeah.
hour and our time here. And one thing that I do want to mention is, and we talked about previously, is what kind of lessons can Sikh communities and wider society
Yeah,
learn from
definitely.
these
Yeah,
groups
that's where we
and
were
that
going to
should
come to. Yeah. Mm.
and one of the things that strikes me, not just looking ahead, but looking at the past, is that Yogi Bhajan and the extensive history of abuse, it very well could have been stopped by the non 3HO Sikh community. So many Sikhs that I talked to in private said, "Oh yeah, we all knew. We knew what was going on. I heard from people. We heard about the stories in the '80s, but there was never any concerted effort to stop it." I know from interviewing someone, by Jeevan Singh of the AKJ, he knew in explicit detail about Yogi Bhajan's abuse. This person I spoke with translated to him
Mm.
directly, yet nothing was done. I think part of this is because of the nature of Sikhi. Sikhi is a congregational tradition. Unlike the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church, we don't have a clear hierarchy.
Mm.
Sikhi is centralized. It's
It's
difficult to
got
mobilize.
decentered. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And again, this is my own opinion, not not the opinion of the program. But I know that when Sikhi is organized for its governing bodies, they're extraordinarily corrupt. That's one of the
Mm.
biggest enablers of Yogi Bhajan. Sikh authorities. I
Yeah.
interviewed people who were responsible for handing bribes to
But
high-ranking
Philip, is
members.
that I mean, in terms of lessons, isn't that just a kind of much more of a general problem with organized religion? I mean, we talked about the sexual abuse scandals in the Roman Catholic Church, which is destroying in North America, particularly a place like Boston, and we hear similar things in other churches and other denominations. So, is that just a general problem, or is there a particular challenge that Sikhs face?
I think it is both. I think abuse is a general
Mm.
problem in every community, in every religious tradition. But I also think that the cultural background and the religious tradition itself provides unique opportunities and challenges to address that
Mm.
abuse.
Mm.
And I think, a good way to think about abuse is, a garbage can in your house. What happens if you leave it alone? What happens if you say someone else will take care of it? Oh, we'll do it next week. It festers and it stinks and it ruins the house.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic place to end. You've really kind of nailed it there. I think if we think about what Sikhi means, it means open your eyes, engage, critically engage, examine. This is what Sikhi is, and we've heard from Philip Deslippe of this terrible kind of movement that offered so much, but then revealed so many horrors. And sadly, this isn't just this one story. This is a story that you can find across contemporary history, and we've heard how movements that appear to offer spiritual guidance and individuals and community can also conceal manipulation, abuse, and exploitation. Now, for Sikhs, the case of Yogi Harbhajan Singh raises particularly painful questions about how Sikhs and the tradition uh, became duped, really, and that without sound scholarship and critical thinking, how easily our traditions can be appropriated, reshaped, and misrepresented. And I think the lesson there for us to learn is that this isn't just something that happened in the past. This is happening now as well. And those same strategies that these Indian godmen like Yogi Bhajan used are being used by other people unscrupulously. So this is clearly damaging, not only for those who become entrapped in those cults and those movements, but if they're propagated in the name of Sikhi, then the Sikh image itself gets damaged. So if there's a lesson for us all to learn, is to remain, as Philip was saying, vigilant, to question charisma, to resist the commodification of spirituality. Whenever people start asking for money, be suspicious, and to protect vulnerable individuals from harm particularly. And I would argue that true spirituality should never come at the cost of exploitation. So thank you for watching, and thank you to the Punjab Broadcast Channel as well. Sky768 for supporting the Sikh Think Tank Show. And until next time, and thank you, Philip, once again for joining us from Los Angeles. Fateh Blau, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.